Anything back?
Quality's all in there. I was really happy. It was like $150.
Yeah.
That's like 20, 30 bucks. This last season.
The guest of honor is there.
Sorry about that. Get everybody's mic 360 so I can tell when we're not supposed to be there where you're at, so I can tell. Nope, I'm not there.
I'm not asking for it, but if you need assistance.
Good evening. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Invite everyone to please rise and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Flag is over here. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Kathy, would you call the roll?
Jim Decker.
Here.
Steve Nelson. Dan Chadwick.
Here.
Julian Davis. Here. Michael Vita.
Here.
Jeff Jones.
Present.
Kristen Wright. Here. Lawrence Present.
Are there any changes to the agenda as proposed? Is there a motion to adopt the agenda as proposed?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor say aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda as proposed?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Roll call.
Jones.
Yes.
Wren.
Yes.
Shiloh.
Yes.
Davey.
Yes.
DeVita.
Yes.
John Beck.
Yes. Is there a motion to approve the NIA consent agenda as presented?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Roll call.
Wren.
Yes.
Shiloh.
Yes.
Davey.
Yes.
DeVita.
Yes.
Jones.
Yes.
Nelson. I'm sorry, John Beck.
Yes. Motion passes. Audience to visitors. Is there anyone in the audience this evening who would like to address the board on any particular issue? Okay. We'll move on then to communications, correspondence, informational items, letters and newsletters. I saw the scariest reference that I've seen in a long time in those newsletters. 150 acts sent to the governor that deal with education. 150. That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Local control, though. So I guess we'll learn more about that as the days go by and we see what he signs and what he doesn't sign, and get as much information as we can, because there's a lot of stuff coming down the pike with those 150 acts. Anything else? Any other comments on the letters or newsletters?
No, just related to that, but maybe under future business, would just be if we could get a presentation maybe from Chris on what changes, at least from a curriculum standpoint, get signed into law. I know some concerns were raised to me by constituents about changes to sexual education aspects of it.
Yep. Yeah, and that's not the only curricular changes.
Right. So we can get a
hopefully,
summary of that at some point this summer.
yeah, hopefully we'll get some more concise information, especially after the governor goes through the bills. So we'll see what he vetoes and what he lets go through. FOIA requests? Pretty quiet. Suspension report. Little unrest at the middle school for the last.
Been quiet lately.
You miss it though.
Yes.
Committee reports. Are there any committee reports?
The athletic council met for the first time, and maybe ever. Apparently, there is not an active athletic council, but Chauncey Carrick and I had a meeting, and it was productive. Filled me in on what's going on in the athletics world, and things are looking good. And in terms of the Spartan Senate, otherwise known as the High School Parents Advisory Committee, it's now been renamed the Spartan Senate. Tim Carlson said that they'll be starting that up again in September. And then Sports Boosters, I talked to the new leadership there, And they'll be having their first meeting again coming August, so.
Yeah. And this Friday is for the love of the game and the golf.
Yes.
Golf outing.
Yep.
Any other committee reports? Thanks, Michael. Superintendent's report.
Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to kick off the superintendent's report. As we do in the past, it's just a couple of slides to set some context for our mission, empowering all learners to succeed in their world. Our vision was just to provide an ideal learning experience where students and staff are engaged and want to come back the next day. Our core values: honesty, trustworthiness, integrity, equality, empathy, respect, citizenship, digital citizenship, responsibility, and collaboration. The 5 questions our professional learning communities ask themselves and discuss. What do we want students to know and learn? What do students want to know and learn? How will we know if they have learned it? What will we do if they don't learn it? And what do we do if they already know it? And with that, the first item under superintendent's report is a presentation from Lauren Holtz, who's the executive director of the Sycamore Education Foundation. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wilder, and thank you to the board. I so appreciate the opportunity to speak to you tonight, just to provide you a year-end update on the foundation and everything that we've done throughout this year. So just to recap our year a little bit, starting off with our largest fundraising event, Take Root. We recreated that event into a virtual event this year, and it turned into quite the celebration, and it was actually very successful. We raised about $25,000 off of that event, and it was a 10% increase from the previous year, which was actually an in-person event. So that was really encouraging to see that the community really came together and supported education here in Sycamore, despite it being a little bit unusual. Additionally, we raised almost $15,000 during Get DeKalb County this year in May, which was a 25% increase from the previous year as well. So we're seeing some great growth with our fundraising events through the foundation, all during a pandemic. So that's very encouraging to see as well. We also raised $37.50 in sponsorships from local businesses for our Spartans Read Together program that we partner with the district on, and that is the reading program throughout all the elementary schools. And this year the book was Charlotte's Web, and it was quite the hit. We even had outdoor movie nights for all the elementary schools held here at the high school on the football field. So I know many families were appreciative of that. This year, we also established a brand new scholarship, the Liam P. Sullivan Memorial Scholarship for graduating seniors. And that scholarship has actually reached over $10,000. So at this point, it's at a level of endowment. So we'll be working with the DeKalb County Community Foundation to work on that endowment and make sure that that scholarship can carry on forever at this point. We also launched a brand new fundraising event, Virtual Trivia Night, where we had 18 teams competing. A number of people in this room were actually participants, and it was the event raised about $1,300. This year we plan on taking that event in person and making it where you would come buy a ticket for your team. So we're hoping that we would be able to garner a little bit more revenue and even sell sponsorships since we had such a strong interest. And then finally, we helped celebrate the class of 2021 by coordinating and distributing over 200 senior signs this year. We also established a fund on behalf of the senior class where we helped to raise funds that contributed to the senior dodgeball tournament, senior signs for financially challenged families, graduation masks for every senior that walked, and also the banner signs that you see in downtown Sycamore that will be able to be utilized for years to come. So that was just kind of a little bit about our year. And then for the grants, we ended up funding 6 grants totaling $7,500. Some of the grants that we funded at the middle school were Little Bit Electronics Kits and Spiro RVR robot packs that support the G-Force Club. So that is a STEM club that is specifically targeted for girls. At South Prairie, we contributed to help be able to purchase decodable books for students. At Southeast, we helped purchase Apple technology, which supported a 3D printer. At West, we also helped purchase picture books to support social emotional learning. At Southeast, we also helped to purchase a shared reading book library to support kindergarten and first grade classrooms. And then additionally, Lisa Winters, who is the instructional math coach for all the elementary schools, she received funding to purchase math literature. So for this year, our grants were a little bit light, so we funded 6 this year, which is definitely on the lower end for us. We didn't see quite as many grants this year, which was to be anticipated a bit since it was such an unusual circumstance for so many educators. So with that, we have a number of dollars that we're rolling over into our grant making fund for our next fiscal year. So we anticipate a large increase in those grant applications. So we look forward to being able to fund many more grants in the next year, in 21-22. So some of our goals for this next fiscal include formalizing the Sycamore Alumni and Friends brand and begin to provide reunion planning assistance, in-person meetups, connection opportunities, utilizing a new alumni website and database technology. And we've really gotten to the point with the foundation where we have a strong schedule of fundraising events that are really great here in our local community. But it's really time that we start looking at our alumni who live all over the nation that can come back and support the schools here and give back that way. So I think it's really the right time to look beyond Sycamore, DeKalb County, to grow our foundation. We also are going to be updating our accounting and our donor management systems this year. I'm also working on developing an annual partnership program focused on a 1-ask method and providing our donors with all program and events for the coming year so that they can select the level of support that's the best fit for them. So oftentimes we see donor fatigue when we go back to businesses and donors every single event, every single ask. This way we'll be able to lay out the year all at once for them, and they'll be able to select the level that's the best fit for them. We're also planning on rolling out an employee payroll deduction program to encourage donations from 427 staff. This was actually something we had planned to do last year, but with everything that had occurred with the pandemic and the start of schools, we just felt like it wasn't the right time. So this year, as we're getting back to normal, it definitely feels like the right time to do that. Finally, we're looking to create a donor wall here at the high school to acknowledge SEF contributors. That's also something that we're planning on incorporating within the annual partnership package so that any donor $500 and above would receive that special recognition here at the high school, and that would be updated annually. So we've been working up with Banner Up in Sycamore to come up with a design for that donor wall. Does anyone have any questions?
Lauren, can you talk about the legacy bricks? I was contacted by an alumni that was interested in purchasing, I think, a bigger one for his family, but then one for each of his kids. He said when they were in high school, it was kind of just getting started and they just didn't really take advantage of it. So he came to check it out and he said, I was really appalled by the condition.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
he said, I decided not to do that because of the condition.
Yeah. Actually, so Tim Carlson and I had just met this past week and we did a walk to take a look at the bricks. I understand that there was an original company that was doing the bricks, and so those very first bricks early on weren't really the highest quality of bricks, so unfortunately they've sustained some damage over the years.
Yeah.
There are plans for us to try to work that into our brick budget now, to replace a few each year so that we can start to get those back up to how they should look. But at this point in time, the revenues that we're receiving are gonna just be put back into those bricks to make sure that we can kind of build those back up. But we are still doing the brick campaign, so it's $100 for small bricks and $200 for the large bricks. And we actually partner with the sports boosters on that, so we take a 50-50 split.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions for Lauren?
It was, I think, a great presentation. I think wonderful work this year,
Thank you.
as always. I mean, our thanks to the foundation board and all the foundation members and all the supporters. I mean, they really make the learning experience here a much more richer experience by their contributions. So we really appreciate it. I think that with your report, people can see that there's a tangible result, and that the money that they're contributing is being used very wisely. So I'm sure you'll be inundated by grants
Yes, yes.
this coming year.
I definitely expect that.
So people will be making up for lost snow.
Mhm,
So,
mhm, mhm. Yep,
but our thanks.
all right.
Thanks,
Thank
Lauren.
you so much.
Yeah. That takes us to the next item on the agenda, which is the return to learn update. So I'm going to start with a little bit of data, which is positive news. This is the trend, test positivity, 7-day rolling test positivity in Region 1. And you can still see this is, I believe, over the last 30 days. So you can see that trend continues to go down. The dots are where there was an increase, and even where you see a purple dot, it still seems like it's trending down pretty gradually, but pretty consistently. So that's pretty good news. This is hard to see. This is just the last 10 days in DeKalb County, but you can see that for the most part, other than the most recent data point, they're all under 2. So also good news, very stable, very consistent. That's going to be good news, and I'll touch on that here in just a second. This is also going to be an important metric. We've watched this throughout the school year so far, but I want to touch on it and bring your attention to it again. The 3 most important data points are test positivity, new cases per 100,000 residents, and then the youth case increase. If you can see, I know the lighting's not great, and it's not really to see, but all 3 of those data points are identified as minimal. Minimal, I think moderate, and then there's a higher class where it is of more concern. As we move forward, Illinois Department of Public Health, as well as the DeKalb County Health Department, will monitor data like this, and our ability to loosen restrictions is very likely going to be dependent on the community transmission in our neck of the woods, so to speak. So we want these 3 data points to be minimal. We want the other data that I talked about briefly to be exactly where it's at, if not better, in order to be in the best possible position moving forward to continue loosening restrictions. So again, community transmission will likely play a role in guidance moving forward. Our current trend is stable, stable and positive in our region, county, and community. The district plan has been updated. We'll post that online this evening. I wanted to talk a little bit about return to learn tonight. I won't present a lot of new information, but wanted to touch on that before we posted it, so we'll get that posted tonight. The Department of Public Health and the State Board of Education continue to work towards revised guidance. I will tell you that there is some frustration around the state that the guidance is not out quite yet, but I've been part of regular calls with IDPH and have gotten somewhat regular feedback through multiple channels from the State Board of Education that they are working on revised guidance. It's not quite ready yet. I hear it's gone through a couple of different drafts, so I hope it's going to be released soon. There's a big push to get that information released so that we can continue planning for next year. Some things that I do anticipate are that I do anticipate that face masks are going to be required to some degree. I don't know what that's going to look like quite yet. Governor Pritzker has been very clear that face masks will be required unless the CDC tells us they don't need to be. But we did see some movement on that earlier this year already. So if you're vaccinated, that's been loosened just a little bit. I still think that there will be masks required to some degree, probably younger students, those that aren't eligible for vaccination. Potentially individuals, whether it's students or staff who are eligible and maybe have not had the opportunity or chosen not to be vaccinated. But I think face masks will be required in some form. A couple of things that I think will fall off is that the self-certification piece that we did at the very beginning of the school year, we don't think that that's going to be necessary. The regular reporting of symptoms, IDPH has indicated that that went pretty well this year. Students and staff members reported symptoms, got tested, and that process worked pretty well. So the self-certification is probably not going to be required. One of the other things that will change is the cleaning protocols will probably just go back to normal. So the research has indicated pretty clearly that coronavirus doesn't survive on surfaces for very long. So some of the additional cleaning and disinfecting that we did this year probably won't be required moving forward. So one of the big questions I get is social distancing, close contacts, and quarantines. There's actually a study going on in some schools in Illinois regarding social distancing and the degree to which the coronavirus or COVID may be spreading with students who are a little bit closer than normal. As that study comes to a close, I know that IDPH will take that data into account and will incorporate that with the revised guidance that we get. That's one of the reasons I think that the guidance isn't out quite yet, is that they're waiting for this study to conclude and gather the data. I do anticipate changes with quarantines and close contacts, but again, I'm not sure what that's going to look like quite yet, and I think some of that is going to depend on this study as well as other research, not only from Illinois, but also from across the country. Two of the greatest areas of concern still are meals, especially lunch. That's where the majority of students eat meals in school. Breakfast is also a possibility, but really lunch is the big one. So meals and busing are the other two areas of greatest concern. IDPH has indicated that on a couple of different occasions. Students are unmasked during lunch, and then there's just close proximity on buses. So they are looking into what kind of ventilation happens on buses. If windows are cracked and the roof hatches are open, how much airflow do we get? How does that help keep students safe if we're getting that nice good airflow through the buses? So they're taking a look at that. But those two areas are really getting a lot of attention through IDPH as well as the State Board of Education. So as they come to resolution on those issues, I think that's going to impact the guidance as well. One of the things that we had in place and that schools are being encouraged to do right now is make sure that they have testing in place. We've used Binex rapid testing. We used that this spring for both staff and students. That enables us to test individuals. It's optional, it's not required. So families who have a student that reported COVID symptoms, they can be picked up and taken to a doctor to be tested. But we did offer this optional rapid testing. Our staff is trained on doing that. We did that from the district office. We did that from a couple of other locations throughout the district. So if you present those symptoms, you can see a nurse here in the district and have results within 15 minutes. If the results are positive, that's when the quarantine would start. If the results are negative, it could allow students or staff to go back to the classroom. Not in every single situation. If you're running a fever, we can do the test for COVID. But if COVID test is negative and you're still running a fever, we do still ask that you go home just to not spread whatever other illness you may have. So it can rule that out really quickly, so we'll be able to use that in the fall just like we used it in the spring. There are other testing that's being recommended, but at this point we're not pursuing that. We are waiting for additional information that's likely to come on July 13th. I know that that's the next IDPH school webinar. I'm hopeful that the revised guidance comes out before then, so we have a chance to look at that and then not only get more information on that webinar, but then also ask questions for clarification. So after that July 13th meeting, we'll have another opportunity to consider whether or not we want to pursue other testing. But the rapid Binex testing was really helpful this year, and we think that's going to be really helpful in the fall as well. That's really the updates that I have tonight in terms of return to learning. But I want to pause here and see if there are any questions that I haven't covered or questions about the material that I did present.
I do have since this last meeting, I've been inundated with so many emails. I'm asking you questions that I need to ask you. If it's okay with you, I'd like to ask you a question about the instructional time that you had up here the last time we met. A group of teachers got together and they sent me an email about concern that the new time change, the new schedule, has the high school losing 9 school days of instruction. And I understand the transportation issues. I moved here, I get it. But that was kind of shocking. They had it down to minutes each week and figured this out and saying to me that, the high school kids are starting earlier, which is supposedly against the law now. High school students should be starting later. And and they're getting less instruction. So I was just wondering if that's something that's being taken into account, because that shocked me, because I
Yeah.
thought that's, 9 days of instruction to me is unbelievable, so.
Sure.
You know, I don't know if that's been brought up, if you've been discussing that, but, you know, I don't know how anybody else feels, but I think that's a very concern.
Yeah, it's not the first time I've heard that, and I certainly understand that. So the change in instructional time did, over the course of the school year, reduce instructional time at the high school by 9 days. Certainly was not my intent. So I've heard that concern, and I just want to make sure the board, as well as the public, knows reducing instructional time was not the intent. Busing obviously was a big factor there, staggering the start and the dismissal times. Part of that is due to the transportation limitations and the number of students we can get on buses. Part of that is due to just the difficulty in finding drivers to run routes. You know, we reduced, I think, six routes this year, is that right? And still had mechanics in our transportation office staff driving buses on a pretty regular basis. So a couple factors that are playing into that. One of the things that we'll look at this coming school year is what the daily schedule looks like at all 3 levels. And one of the things we've talked about as a board is reimagining the school day and what that might look like. I'm certainly not looking forward to reducing instructional time, but I think as we move forward, one of the things I think we need to be open to is using time differently than we've used it in the past. So I am not super excited about the reduction in instructional time at the high school, but I think that was an outcome of a variety of factors, some of which I've mentioned here tonight. But your first question was, is that being discussed? Is that something that we're aware of? And absolutely it is.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? From Julian or any other board member?
I guess just from a logistics standpoint, first off, does the IDPH only announce anything on a day of a Sycamore board meeting? It feels like that is but all jokes aside, it being on the 13th, you're I mean, it says it up there, but you're anticipating to get kind of that final, because I think that's the last board meeting before school starts, I guess we're getting it, right? July
We'll
13th.
meet in August.
Autumn, I guess probably a week or two, right? Or
Right.
whatever.
So this is my opinion. This is not fact at all. This is my personal opinion.
Sure.
I think that the goal was to have revised guidance done on or about July 13th, so that webinar coincided with the release of guidance, so that it could be released and then discussed during that webinar. But there are a couple of different organizations, LUDA, which we're a member of, as well as the high school School District Association, have both issued letters to the state superintendent just asking for that guidance to be expedited. So I wouldn't be surprised if the guidance is released earlier than the 13th, and then either that 13th is an opportunity. And what happens on these webinars is that IDPH representatives, the director, communication specialists, a variety of staff members have time to present information, and then there's a running list of questions that are submitted. So they do a really good job of going through those questions and answering them throughout the webinar. Anything that's missed, they answer and respond and post that later. So I think that guidance may likely come out a little bit sooner than that, and then will be discussed on the 13th for sure. They may schedule more. You know, they scheduled one in June, one in July, and one in August, and announced that late May. But with some pressure mounting to get some information and then make decisions, I wouldn't be surprised if things change just a little bit.
And I would have to assume, if anything, it's going to be the relaxing of guidance as opposed to adding additional guidance. And any time anything's relaxed, it's got to be easier to adjust as opposed to the other way. Like basically what we were facing last year as
Yeah.
opposed to this year.
Yeah.
Where, you know, and all of a sudden there's additional, we've got to follow this, and that's putting up huge roadblocks for trying to accomplish something. So.
Absolutely. So if things continue to go well, again, to go back to the community transmission data that I presented earlier,
Sure.
if that continues to be positive and stable, I would anticipate that any changes are going to be loosening restrictions backing those off, not restrictions being, stronger. I think we're in the opposite situation that we were in last year, where we kind of anticipated that there were gonna be more restrictions, we just didn't know what they were going to be. Now, I think there's gonna be fewer restrictions as long as things, continue to go well, and that's really, that's up to not only us here within the school district, but in the community too, just to make sure that we're doing the right thing. As long as those numbers stay stable or continue to trend down, I think any change is really gonna be more loosening of guidance prior to the beginning of the school year.
We'll see.
We'll see. Maybe they were busy writing laws and sending those to the governor and not writing the guidance, but.
Hopefully the governor's hand will be tired from signing all that.
Any other questions for me about return to learning before I move on? Okay. Well, that takes us to the next item under the superintendent's report, and this takes us to a future focused item, and this one really goes back to the previous board meeting where we discussed professional learning communities and how we anticipate using that time in those late start days. Nobody can tell that story better than our teachers, and professional learning communities has been an initiative within the school district for some time. While I'm new here, I've learned a lot about PLCs during my time here. So instead of me telling you what I think about professional learning communities, we've got some experts here who are going to help us out. So I'm going to invite the middle school group to come up, whether that's the group or their spokesperson, and I'm going to click us over to their presentation.
They weren't gonna come up here and tell them they have to.
Justin, would you do me a favor and just introduce yourself as well as the rest of your groups, that way everybody knows everybody?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you for having us. Thanks for listening tonight. I know we're excited to be here despite that it is our summer. This is not the whole team. There's a lot more of us, so if people are traveling or got kids' birthday parties or whatever it may be. We do a lot of things in the summer for family, but my name's Justin Hames. 8th grade science teacher at the middle school. I'll let these folks jump in and introduce themselves too.
Jill Bolder, 7th grade math teacher.
Kevin Boltz, I teach CD courses at the middle school.
Jody Bailey, I teach math and literature at the middle school.
I'm Julie Coyle, and I'm the reading specialist and the paper passer outer.
And Jim's also on the coalition, but you know him. He's our leader. He's our principal. So
he told you to talk.
yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, appreciate it.
Well, thanks to all of you for coming in, especially it's summer. You didn't have to be here, so appreciate that very much.
No problem. And like I said, thank you for this opportunity. Let me just start by saying this past year was a big one, probably the biggest one any of us lived through in education or just lived through, period. I know for me as a teacher in my 11th year of teaching that just wrapped up, it was, I probably learned more and grew more than I ever have personally, professionally, you name it. And there were a lot of challenges and things, but I want to point to some words on this first slide, which was kind of a mantra that we repeated to ourselves throughout the year at the middle school. Together we learn, together we grow, together we spark. To us, that word together didn't really wear out as the year went on. It's something we found empowerment in, and as unpopular as it might be to say, this was one of the best years that I had. Not because of anything personally like that I felt I did, but first of all, I had a great group of students that I worked with this year, and they continue to rise to the occasion without complaining. But the main reason is these people behind me right here and the people that couldn't be here tonight who are members of a group called the PLC Coalition, a committee or team that's been established at the middle school here now for 2 years. And the reason I say that is, it's a blessing to have people you can sit down with and derive energy from, their positive mindset, their productive attitude, despite all of the challenges that we kind of had to encounter this year. We met once a week throughout almost the entire school year. Every Friday before school we met. Sometimes those meetings were going overboard just because we didn't want to stop talking. And I'm really grateful to, maybe it was me, I didn't want to stop talking, but My point is, it was a group where we felt like it wasn't a time sucker. It didn't exhaust us. It was something we derived energy out of. So when it comes to PLC, that's really something that going forward, I hope we view PLC as not a thing we have to do, but a thing that we get to do that injects energy into our conversations and the work we do collaboratively and everything like that. I don't know who's controlling the slides, but you are free to go to the next one. There you go. So one thing that we didn't want to belabor tonight was too much on the information behind PLC. There's plenty out there that you can dive into, and we put out a newsletter that we put out to staff at the end of the year talking about some PLC Institute, this opportunity that we'll talk more about here in a minute. It's coming up in August. But PLC has been around in this district for a while in terms of the terminology. We've heard it over and over and over again. What we're going to talk more about tonight is kind of our story and where we felt empowerment throughout the process, but also when we look towards the future, where the potential lies. But just to define it, PLC is an ongoing process in which educators work collaboratively in recurring cycles of inquiry and research to achieve better results for students. That concept doesn't sound like a new thing, but you really have to be intentional if you want to make that part of who you are, part of your organization, part of your lifestyle in an organization. And three big ideas, if there's somebody who had never heard anything about it, if you were to try to remember three things about PLC, it's that there's a focus on learning, there's a collaborative culture, and focus on results. It's a repeated process. It's not something you just do and check off the list and say you're done. It is your culture. It is everything that you choose to do in a school organization. So here's kind of a history, at least I guess this is kind of a narrative of how we viewed the PLC adventure so far here in District 427. My first year as a teacher was 2010, 2011. And I remember one of our in-service days that year, we focused and rolled out something called PLC. For a lot of us, it was the first time we had ever heard of it, Professional Learning Community. And it was a pretty empowering presentation. We were excited about it. There had been a few staff members who had attended initial training at Stevenson High School at that point. And it was clear that it was this good thing, and everybody was excited. And then over the next several years, we saw things like a PLC meeting schedule get implemented into our daily lives at the middle school, in which you'd work collaboratively with somebody who taught the same subject with you. And you'd hear the words a lot, you'd submit notes and things like that, but over the years with less and less of an intentional focus, by no fault of anybody, but just, once you hit the ground running and you're in the middle of the race, you kind of slow down. We started, or we felt as a coalition, that we started to fall away from some of the initial value systems that are involved in PLC. And I think we realized that in 2019, when Jim set up a training for us all at the middle school. It was voluntary over the summer, but it was a 3-day training called PLC at Work, which was streamed live from Stevenson High School in Lincolnshire. And everybody here attended that training, as well as everybody else on the coalition, as well as more members of the SMS staff. Not all staff attended it, but the people who did, might sound cliche, but it was life-changing. Like, it made us realize all of the things that we could be doing, that we want to get to, that we wanted to make Sycamore Middle School, where we quite weren't there, but it also made us realize there are a lot of things in place, building blocks, where we could get there. So we'll be talking about what we learned from the training here tonight, why we formed a group, a voluntary teacher group called the PLC Coalition, and also maybe what the future has in store. Some aha moments from that 2019 training. We learned, or I guess we're reminded of the fact that PLC is not a meeting. It is not a 40-minute time block in which you go get something done, you get through your agenda, and then you wait till the next meeting to get content. It really is a lifestyle. It is ingrained into every lesson that you do with your kids, every assessment you give, every conversation you have. And it doesn't just include the teachers, not even the counseling staff. It includes everybody from the custodian to the school nurse to the school board to administrators. It is the entire community. It is not this thing that you try to put into a box. It's something you choose to adopt as an organization. And that's where we realize this is about culture and the culture of learning more than it is just planning. It's about collaboration, not coordination. There's a distinct difference we found when we went to the training. Another thing is PLCs are not about adding something new, it's about getting great at what works. It's not trying to add something to our plate, it's rather reacting to the science of our profession, going, is this simple, is this clear? Collaboration might be tough sometimes when you have different personalities in a room, but it's the right route to accomplishing and being successful with students. And then the last thing is the why has to precede the how and what. If I could provide an example, a couple years ago, we tried to implement an intervention block at the middle school, and we tried to put the cart before the horse, where we got all the logistics down and the schedule and everything like that, but we forgot to think about the why with staff. There wasn't a whole lot of buy-in, and it kind of steered off course a little bit. We were reminded at this training that the why is really, really important, and before you implement the how you're going to get there and what you're going to do to get there, you really have to consider about the why, and if I could add who as well, your students and the learners in the community. So here's the full list, and I'm not going to read every name, but if I could sum up the list of those are people we're really lucky to have at Sycamore Middle School. And I could say that about way more people that are on this list, but I'm really honored to call these people my colleagues because they volunteered their time the last 2 years to work on the PLC Coalition because they thought it was so important. They attended the training and they all were like, yes, let's do this. And this is not I know I'm speaking a lot here tonight, but these meetings are, a majority of them is not me speaking, it's everybody. It's very collaborative in nature. The other thing I want to point out about this list is I think, represents a good cross-section of the building. There's not a department or grade level that we feel like we miss by this representation of teachers. So when we talk about and collect opinions and collaborate, we really feel like we're gaining an adequate pulse of how the building feels. Because you have to understand, the other 5 days of the week that you're going out and doing your job, these people are working with different individuals who are a member of the SMS PLC, gaining input from them, hearing some of the positive things that are said, hearing some of the negative things that are said. We come back and we meet on Fridays, we're getting kind of a collective view of how, I guess, the PLC is responding to the work we're doing.
And this has been an open door committee from the very beginning. So if there are some things that we're going to discuss in our meeting, people pop in, I want to talk about that. I've got some insight in that. So it's not just the ideas are not just from people on the committee. There's people coming in who just like one meeting here or there to talk about some different things that they feel to talk about as it pertains to the professional and the community at our school.
So, and why we exist, if I haven't made that clear enough, our focus is, kind of drew this up and it's evolved over a 2-year period, but surveying pathways and barriers to obtaining the desired SMS PLC and cultivate conditions necessary for us to grow as a middle school. So really, to keep ourselves focused and on task, we are really focused on culture, communication, and collaboration. Those 3 C's have kind of been the drive of the work we do. Constantly gathering feedback, but also taking that feedback and making things happen based upon what we feel, where we feel our culture is at within the PLC, how communication is going, and how we're collaborating, not just our team, but as we see it throughout the building. So I'm going to let Kevin jump in on this slide, but what we're going to do next is kind of break down each year and kind of the journey that we've been through as a coalition.
So after the training, and I've gone to a training previously in my previous district, everyone was energized of what to do and how to move this thing forward and had ideas and where we wanted to go. And one of the main things they came across with was like forming an identity, right? Having the identity of the middle school, strictly and how it pertains to the district's big, larger PLC. So what we first started doing was create a vision for ourselves, right? We got together and said, okay, we need a new mission statement for the middle school. What is it? We started to derive it ourselves, right? And it was a group of the people that were on that list. We started deriving these mission statements, putting them together, and said, okay, we're going to present this to the staff, and this is where we're going to go. Well, it was a complete and utter failure, I think. Because we did come up with a mission statement, but if you ask me what it was, I have no idea. And that was, yeah, there was 10, and they were like a paragraph long. I'm like, okay, this is not it. And so then we started to go back and look at, okay, we need to get our staff involved and create a mission statement that's more organic in what we do on an everyday basis. So we start with, like Justin said, with the culture. We start with this survey that we sent out to our staff, that when we started putting these questions together, we knew it was going to be an interesting responses. Because we asked questions that we asked staff, when we presented it, to be two things: vulnerable and reflect. If you're not willing to be vulnerable in what you're doing and looking at truly what you're doing to your core, PLCs don't work. And if you're not willing to be reflective in that process, they don't work either. So we said, okay, in order for this to work, you have to be, those two things have to be in play. And some of the questions we sent out were, what are some things that you feel is like impactful in your classroom? What's your ideal culture within your classroom? What are obstacles right now where you're not meeting your optimum educational culture in your classroom? And we got about 34 pages worth of responses.
We had almost 90% of the staff answer the survey for us.
And so what we did was like, okay, here we go. And we spent, pre-COVID meetings, so that first year, diving into those, what they were saying, talking about it in faculty meetings, talking about it in our PLCs. And what we got, the impression we got is that people really wanted this to work. And the feedback caused us to kind of go back to that revision statement of, okay, here's why I exist, here's where we need to go. And over the form of different faculty meetings, everything else, we came up with what we called our cultural values and what we value to act, what would ultimately create a culture of excellence. And if you want to go to the next slide, this is what we came up with. And this was derived from our faculty during meetings, deliberating on those things. And you can see there some of those same things that are, are in our strategic plan. But we felt as a building, this was our focus moving forward, establishing the culture that would make PLCs successful in our building. And it kind of grew into pandemic time. And you'll see what we did with the Spartan View that kind of builds off this culture.
Yeah. And to just give you some context, where we came up with these culture values, that was like one of the most, I don't know if this is something people routinely say, but that was an exciting staff meeting for me. It was very, I think what we were effective in the way we gathered these is we, well, instead of us standing up here and talking about it, let's get people actually collaborating. So a teacher who's not here right now, her name's Jill Anderson, came up with the idea. She's like, well, how about we send them around the room to these big pieces of sticky paper and just have them brainstorm in small groups with whoever they're comfortable with and start jotting down, answering the questions like, what are the value systems that you think we need to be more intentional about in order to obtain a PLC culture of excellence? And they gave us many and many, and so what we did is we broke the data down and we put them all up in a room, our team, and narrowed it down to the ones that you see up here. And we realized that before we get to that mission statement or before we become more intentional about PLC logistical things, we really need to cultivate the soil and get people on board and understanding that we're emphasizing these values as a part of what we do. And like I said, an analogy we use a lot is cultivating the soil so PLC can grow. So if you go to the next slide, pandemic hits. We had our virtual meetings at the end of that year Kevin just discussed. We were pretty busy at the beginning of this year, and a couple months went by where we just didn't talk, we didn't meet, we were learning all this new technology. We were just trying to keep our, I think, miles above water and keep going. But at least a good sign to me is people kept coming to me and other members of the coalition and saying, are you guys meeting? I have concerns. Or are you guys meeting? Like, I have questions about what you guys are looking at. And although it was unfortunate at that point for me to say, like, actually, no, we've just been just so busy that we haven't been. And then Liz Blevins, who was a counselor with us, said, if we're not going to meet this year, we shouldn't be meeting at all. Like, this is the year where we really need to be intentional, not only so we don't lose the progress that we really felt that year before that with staff, but also, like the people need that sense of togetherness. People are kind of yearning for it. So some things that we did this year, if I could just describe, and I'll let the team jump in here, is we really wanted to focus on keeping people connected and together. And that was hard, especially during remote learning when everybody was in their room with their door shut. So we started something called the Spartan View, a newsletter which came out twice a month. You may have seen it on one of our last issues of the school year was right here. This one focuses more on the PLC Institute that is happening this summer to kind of inform staff and personnel about that. But these things were anything to celebrate what staff is doing, to highlight creative ideas, to shed a light on innovative things that were happening around the middle school and jumpstart conversations. Some of the stuff was light and fun, like interviews with teachers. Some was more serious, like challenging teachers to think about taking on, you know, certain topics or ideas or conversations in the middle of a pandemic. But it was something we got a lot of positive feedback on from staff throughout the year. Another thing that I found personally impactful that we did this year was we chose to ask kids how they felt we were doing and how they felt the year was going. I'll never forget a meeting where we chose to do that because I was personally approached by an 8th grader who kind of put it bluntly, but truthfully, she's like, there's all these surveys, the parents are taking surveys, the teachers are taking surveys, when am I gonna get asked? And I just looked at her and said, you know what, you're right. And because she said that, the next meeting, we're like, we gotta ask the kids. So Joe Anderson, Jill Boldo were the two who put together this amazing survey. And the students just said incredibly insightful things. And we took a couple meetings to just dissect that. And that was right at a time where we were pivoting from like the hybrid learning to kind of a full return. So we really wanted to be intentional about not losing our remote learners during that time and keeping them engaged. So we got a lot of good suggestions from students. But now, if you'll go to the next slide here. So this is just a brainstorm. We just kind of threw stuff. If you want to latch onto something tangible that we feel we've accomplished in the last 2 years, this is kind of just some of the things that we've implemented to focus on that communication, culture, collaboration. And I don't know if you guys want to jump in and anything that's been impactful for you as you reflect on the work you've done that's on the list or not, but feel free.
Well, and going back to the Spartan View that you have in front of you, every month we came back with like one of those new focuses based on one of those cultural statements that we are, those values that we mentioned earlier. So we had one on technology innovation, we had one on accountability. So the focus of the Spartan View changed month to month to give staff members a way of kind of insight on how they can implement that in their classroom, as Justin stated before. The Twitter discussions, we had 2 of those throughout the year that were optional, but the conversations that came from those were awesome, and it actually got people actually doing more professional Twitter chats outside of SMS, and has created, you know, one person like, oh, I didn't know I could have like a throw a conversation with somebody from California, and now we're texting back and forth, and I'm like, yeah, it can happen. You know, professional development doesn't always just happen in meetings anymore. Social media is a great form of professional development, and Twitter discussions, depending on what category it is, it's been a really great thing that we started here, and we'll continue to try to do throughout the next years as well, even when we're in person.
For me, one thing that, I had an incident where a staff member was just in a random conversation with a staff member who doesn't even know that I'm on this coalition. And in the conversation, she mentioned how she was feeling a shift in the culture at SMS, how she was feeling this positivity that she was surrounded by at SMS. And 2 things that I took away from that. One was, this is just a random conversation I'm having with someone who doesn't have to share that with me. And I was feeling it, but I felt like maybe I was feeling it because I was energized by these people. But the fact that someone outside of our group was also getting that positivity really sort of was significant to me. And the second thing was, it was during a year when it was so easy for us to go dark. You know, it was difficult to stay positive. More people, I felt like it was just easy to be negative. And so those 2 things really made me feel like, yes, what we're doing is, the beginning of what we're doing matters. It's making a difference.
And dovetail off of that.
Come on, Jill.
Go ahead.
Well, I was the first one after the coalition formed to go to Stevenson. Jim let me go by myself, which was awkward because I'm kind of awkward anyways. But it was really fun. I was super energized when I got back to bring all that information back to everyone. Their culture, their community, and their school was really incredible to see, and to be piggyback off of Julie, seeing that this year, kind of that shift, that change a little bit, and we're never gonna be Stevenson because we're just a different community, which is great, but we're gonna be our own form of PLC, and so seeing that shift though to change, that culture changing, seeing how our kids were and how they responded to that this year was really amazing to see. Sorry, Julie.
It's all good. Just to highlight more student successes, we had a chance to look at the math data from winter of 2019. No.
It was January 20, but yeah.
Okay.
Winter.
So about an 18-month spread of data, and our students rose in every grade level in both reading and math. So all of the negativity that was out there telling us that we weren't gonna be able to do what we needed to do this year, the positivity both from this group that we are with and also from just the teachers feeling it, and I think, well, I'd like to think that what we were doing with putting out challenges and whatnot to staff and just trying to keep everybody up and engaged, like, it went through to the students, and as Justin had said, they brought it, they didn't shy away, they excelled through some of hopefully what's gonna be their worst years, and rose to the occasion and beyond.
And one of the things reasons that was positive to us, is one of the things we were forced to do finally was pare down our curriculum and focus on only what was essential. And some people had a hard time letting go of that before this pandemic hit, so it forced people to, right? And so the prediction was, well, kids aren't gonna learn as much. But what happened is we were more intentional about the essentials that we were paring it down to. At least that's the kind of hypothesis we derived from all of this. And that is like a bright spot for the future, right? Because it shows that less is more. When we go back to the drawing board and start looking at our standards, there are things that we can focus on more deeply and things that we don't have to as much. And lo and behold, kids are still gonna learn.
Just something that I want you to know is that we, the board members, all get the Spartan View in our board packets. So we've been reading it for probably as long as it's been coming out.
Awesome.
And I was really, I was both surprised and more enthusiastic after reading the last issue where he talked about the math data, because that was totally unexpected for me. I really was with the rest of the crowd, which thought we'll be behind for some time. That was great news. And then the comments you just made that were also in that article, I don't know if you wrote the article or not, but they were in there about how getting down to the basics, getting back to the basics, and that worked because you were more intentional about that. So it would be very interesting to see where you go with that going forward.
Yeah.
But we have been keeping track here. So
I'm glad to hear that, yeah. So that means Jim's been sharing them with you, which has been great. So thank you for taking the time on those. It's hopefully something we can continue next year. We're not going to have the Friday time as often, but we still want to get it out there when we feel a message needs to be heard or something important to say. So.
I thought, it was my own personal opinion, that it was a great offer. So it was,
okay, thank you.
It was appreciated.
All right, transition to Kevin here a little bit.
All right.
Thank you guys.
So the future focus of SMS, where are we at, where are we going? And the kind of focus we have for this year is kind of reestablishing or establishing that community of learners. Understanding that learners means teachers, parents, and students. And looking at, for our SMART goal number 1 is going back to what we originally failed at the first time and look at those cultural values that we identified there. We're going to pare those down to 3 or 4. There's Jeff Zulrein, is that the guy? Yeah. He did a blog about this whole idea of cultural values and commitment statements for different, Fortune 500 companies, and paring them down to 4 or 5 and really focusing on those 4 or 5 and making sure every stakeholder in your organization and our PLC understands those and what their roles are and their responsibilities and those commitments. And then obviously going back and reestablishing that building mission statement that falls under the umbrella of the district's mission statement. So we have the identity, so when kids come in, they know exactly what kind of our role is. And then obviously reestablishing some of those building norms. Now, we understand norms are gonna change and are going to be adapted based on, different departments or whatever else, but we also want the building to know, hey, these are the norms for our building, and that's who we are as a PLC. And like I said before, most of those come through the strategic design that's already established, but focusing on that from a teacher, student, staff, custodians, parents, everything. Number 2 is actually something that we've kind of looked at from our building leadership committees, and reestablishing and defining more clearly what everyone's role is. And this is something kind of, if you've ever been to one of our special ed meetings, or you've had an opportunity to hear that, every time there's a special ed meeting, everybody in the room goes, my name is so-and-so, and here's my role in the meeting. And I think in some cases, some of our committees were kind of intertwining in what they were doing. We were working on this, and so were they. So redefining and reestablishing those definitions and leadership roles will do a couple different things. Number 1, it allows us to complete or execute more in 1 year, because everyone's working on a little bit different piece of the puzzle. Number 2, I'm hoping that it allows, when people know their role, they're more have ownership into the role, and more staff will be wanting to be a part of these different committees. I know being on 2 of these myself, it's kind of hard to kind of make time for all the different committees. So I'll obviously bring more people into the puzzle. And again, I think that it'll make us a more effective PLC in what we're trying to accomplish if everyone's working on different pieces and then everyone comes together for the same goal, which is obviously the mission statement, right, and our focus commitments. And then goal number 3, this kind of goes back to this idea of reestablishing the capacity of what PLCs are and the strategies to make us more effective. We've had a PLC for 10 years. How effective has it been? How effective is it in our building? How efficient is it in our building? And that's a question that I think every building could ask that question on. Our situation is a little bit different than elementary school, because we're all at different stages of this process. Right? I think elementary school is at a very different state. High school is at a different state. Sydney and Phoebe will talk about that. And so looking at where we're at right now and building capacity of why, what we're doing, and just like our students in the fall, right? We're going to meet them where they're at. Our professional development, our whatever that might be, podcasts, the Spartan View, whatever, has to meet our departments where they're at in this process. We have some departments that are at all different stages of the process. So some departments are going to need a little bit more help on data-driven decisions, because they already have their essentials done, they already have their assessments done, and now they're looking at how can I identify, when it comes back to learners, how do I know what they learned, how do I know when they learned it, and what am I going to do when I know they do it, right? That's the focus of our guiding questions we ask every day, every board meeting, and whenever our meetings. And then hopefully, as just said before, we've cultivated the soil. People are ready to have some of these conversations, because some of them aren't going to be very difficult to have. We're reminding the staff, our goal is number 1, student learning, results, collaboration. And for students to be successful in our district, in our building, that's what we have to do. Be vulnerable, be reflective, and it'll all work. And I think, going through the learning by doing handbook, providing those various forms of professional development is what our goal number 3 is for our building. And that kind of goes into the last thing, which is our new PLC at work, which is the last Institute Day.
All of you got an email in your board email with an invitation to come to these 3 days. You can come to 1, 2, or all 3 days, with the agenda of what happens on each of the days. If you're interested in coming, just email me and I'll make sure to put you in on the list. If you let me know before the end of June, I'll make sure that you get the book. If you let me know before the end of July, I'll make sure you get in on the food for lunch. If you want to come the day before, it's still fine. You can come. I just can't get you in on all the orders. But if you just let me know, and if you would rather I send that to your personal email, just email me, and I'll respond back to you with the agenda and everything in there. It's a very important time for us to have everybody we can get to this PLC training again. This will be a retraining for some of us, an initial for others, and it's very important.
It doesn't sound like a lot of fun to spend your summer, your last few days of summer to do something like this, but it actually really is. It's really informative great stuff that they bring to us, so, and it's really awesome. And also getting more teachers up to Stevenson is another one of our things that we'd like to do, is we've got more teachers already scheduled to go out, I think, next year, so.
It's Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, not Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
That would be my fault.
It's a-
The days are quite though.
We'll make sure you get the right answer.
The dates are,
Yeah.
Well, again, to wrap up, we appreciate you giving us the time to talk about what it is at our building, and we're happy to answer any questions you guys have.
So Kevin, you talk about measuring the effectiveness. What are you measuring? Like, what specifically are you looking at? So, on one hand, I see such positivity in creating a better culture and a more positive environment. And I'm not sure you could ever really measure that. But are you looking at specific things that you're really gonna try to measure to see the effectiveness of a PLC?
Yeah, I think it goes back to student learning. And it goes back to looking at if our departments have our essential standards identified, they've created these common formative assessments, then when common formative assessments occur, data can be collected, and during those PLC times, teachers can talk about, you know, hey, Joey didn't do very good on my test.
Right.
You know, what are some things he struggled with this vocabulary term? And that goes back to another thing about the interventions, of looking at, you know, what do we do when Joey didn't get it? And taking that time to look at, okay, what do I need to teach? Does this give me a more elaborate intervention? And I think student growth is how you're gonna make this, how you're gonna identify it successful. Whether it be with map testing, whether it be with common formative assessments, you know, and that's how you're gonna gauge the effectiveness of our PLC. Now, you know, there's a whole rubrics, in the book, there's whole rubrics on how effective you think your PLC is. And I think our focus gotta be right away on that student learning piece. And then I think as we grow, then it expands into, you know, how do we expand our PLC in the community? And, you know, the high school has their Spartan Senate, right? Well, what does that look like for the middle school? Like, can we do something like that here? And I think as more and more of these ideas are cultivated and we get into the idea and we start diving into really the effectiveness and the strategies of an effective PLC, I think that's when you'll see when it truly becomes successful. When we're meeting our goals, we're hitting the academic standards, but also kids are wanting to come back to school. They're engaged in what they're doing, they're empowered by what they're learning in the classroom to actually do something that they can do, whether it be in clubs or whatever else.
And the reason why we spend so much time on our culture is, I don't know if you've ever been in a meeting where you've had to look at data comparing how you've done to somebody else. That's not easy. And you're looking at a set of data showing that your students kind of faltered in one area on the assessment. You have to be able to be vulnerable and trust the people that you're meeting with. And if we didn't have that positivity and that trust with one another, those conversations could never happen.
So that's how I would gauge staff. Like, how do I know if it's successful?
Right.
When a teacher can come into a meeting and say, I failed at this, can you guys help me?
So I totally agree with you. As you were talking, I was thinking, okay, so really hard conversations to have sometimes, right? For the reason Joel just said. Is in each of the PLCs, is there somebody that's really trained on how to make your PLC a better, more effective environment? You know, I can just imagine a group getting together and falling into those old ways of feeling like, oh, I'm the person that has the problem.
And that does happen, so you just have to kind of get that focus back. And I think this year through our newsletters and different things, and just how in the hallways that, I don't know, we call it a PLC in the hallway, but it sometimes is where you're saying those things and you have those
Right.
moments. And it is hard to be vulnerable and to say that stuff, but you definitely, yeah, you can, it goes back to that.
And this is why we start, it seems like it's this process, and this is the beginning of that process, to grow that sort of vulnerability, the reflection, those things that Justin was talking about. There has to be that, you know, that sort of trust, and that starts with culture. So it is a process. It's like we're doing steps, and we've started, and we've been successful, I think, at making, at, you know, cultivating that culture.
And that goes back to that goal number 3 I was talking about with building capacity and like meeting different groups where they're at. I think that we're gonna start off by evaluating themselves, are they a good team or not? And looking at, you know, there's, you know, we're using the handbook on that. And then really having those discussions, and you're right, sometimes there has to be like a third party in there where we come in and we're helping with that. And if that means that's part of the professional development, then that's what happens during our PLC times on those late start Thursdays or however those work. And I think that's where capacity of why is the most important part, because once they know the why and why we're doing it and why we're here and why we're committed to this process, if they're not, then, you know, they're gonna kind of be the odd person out. And what it comes down to is, when it comes to hiring and whatever else, here's what we are, here's what we need, and that's gonna be stated, that's gonna be given to any teacher that applies for a job here at Sycamore Middle School. And they'll know right from the beginning about what the commitments are that every teacher's committed to in this building and what we're striving for. And if they're not part of it, then it might not be their building for them.
That makes me super excited. I think it's great.
Yes.
So your customer are the PLC, grade level PLCs themselves? I mean, is that who you serve, or who your efforts are directly
We serve
The students.
affecting?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, yeah.
The PLC as a whole, or the coalition? I guess that's where I'm struggling, is the coalition is kind of a superset of the PLCs, like you guys help the PLCs be more effective, or you're actually?
Yeah, what's up?
That goes back to goal number 2.
Yeah.
That goes back to goal number 2
Yeah.
with redefining our roles within the PLC. We've had drawn out conversations about where our role in this is, and currently when we look at it, our role is to try to roll out the PLC process strategies to make it more effective, which ultimately, again, we go back to it, every conversation should be student-centered and student learning, and it doesn't make a difference if it's better for me or worse for me or whatever else. It's about what makes our students successful in the building. So I think indirectly, yeah, we always have the students in mind, but this process is what everyone's, like, if you have the students in the center, that's the bullseye, right? Everything else around it funnels to that bullseye. And if we're missing a piece on the outside, the funnel falls apart, the water goes the other way.
Oh, I agree, and I mean, I think everybody in this room would say we're ultimately here for the learners, but in trying to judge your effectiveness, and this is where I kind of go back to the science side of things, like, we gotta know what we're measuring and what we have control over. We don't have a control group that's isolated from this process where we can say, well, look, they didn't make progress, but the ones that were part of this process did, so therefore we know this process works. I mean, you've got so many pieces across the district trying to make improvements at every grade level that, yeah, we'd love to see the test scores rise across the board, and if we do, how do we know which group to point to and say, you did it, it was your group?
Well, I think that's another part about the PLC. It's not about me, it's about us and the community.
Right.
And no matter if we're looking at MAP scores and we're looking at, you know, reading, for example, there's reading in my STEM courses that the kids don't get in literature class that could have helped those MAP scores, or MAP scores, sorry. So I think when we start looking at those different pieces, yeah, you're not gonna be able to isolate one specific group, but like, okay, so if you take that, for example, you look at, okay, on a MAP test score, we isolate one particular subgroup that didn't do well across the board, then that's where we jump into the effectiveness of the PLC, look at research data-driven things that are how to be more effective with that subgroup, then that forms our professional development, and that's what we're focused on to fill those gaps and those voids that we have within either our instruction, curriculum, could be our, you know, discipline or behavior interventions, it could be any aspect of that. So, I mean, once you start diving into like what PLC actually is, it's like Mary Poppins bag, right? Like you just keep digging out and stuff just keeps coming out, you know, and if you start looking deep into that hole, it's really easy to get overwhelmed. And sometimes when I start talking and everyone's like, oh my God, you gotta stop.
Yeah.
Like, I hope this doesn't sound bad, but like, bad way to preface this.
No offense.
No, but like, there's kind of like a cognitive dissonance journey that created this PLC coalition, right? The idea that we've confronted that there are some things wrong within our system that need to be fixed. And we might not be sure about what those things are that need to be fixed. But we are willing to take a collective look at how we can help with that. And our role has kind of constantly kind of evolved throughout this process based upon the feedback that we've gotten from staff and students in those surveys. So a lot, like, yeah, you said something about measuring culture. I think we all believe we can measure that. Sure, the data is more qualitative in nature, but people were vulnerable and honest and truthful, and we got 90% of the building to fill that out. Our students, it was something like in the upper 600s of our 900-something students that took the student survey this year. People will tell you if you ask them questions, and we got to do something with that information. And part of why we're presenting here tonight is like, we might not know what is at the end of the tunnel, but like, we want to be more intentional about going towards it. You know what I mean? Like, we need to figure out some of the questions that Eric's asking, how we can better measure data, have conversations surrounding those data, give PLCs information that they can use to more effectively talk about kids and have difficult conversations, but also like, communication is something we've recognized has to be a little better in our building, maybe in the district. Like how we're not really sure what this MTSS committee is talking about or this building leadership team is talking about. Why don't I know what conversations are happening in those meetings? Like, it's hard to say what our role is when all of those roles haven't been defined either. So we recognize that that's something that has to be in place before we can really start digging in and looking at the quantitative stuff.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I think that's where I was trying to go with this, is I see the more valuable feedback that you can get being that more qualitative data, which is, because I guess in my understanding of your presentation, you guys are just kind of you're the PLC champions, right? You're trying to improve the PLC process.
Hold on, we didn't get a trophy.
I mean, you're championing the PLC cause, right? So I mean, if you improve that process, then all the participants in it, which would include students, but will include the teachers in the PLC committees themselves, you know, they will all feel more productive, and this whole process is more rewarding. So I see the qualitative feedback from that being very instrumental in knowing whether this is effective or not.
Well, just the talk of making professional development more focused and intentional, to me, that's like a huge win. Rather than these kind of blanket professional development, rather zeroing in on, there's real issues and this is what they are and here's how we're gonna fix them.
You know, and one final thing before some of the high school is going to present, or Sydney is going to come over here.
We did our presentation, so we're
is that when we set this up, this is where we're at SMS, right? We're kind of all over the place when it comes to PLC. High school is probably a different stage, and elementary is also at a different stage. So this isn't like what the whole district looks like. I want to kind of make that, stress that this is strictly, we're only focusing on our little piece right now. And as Mr. Wilder came to one of our meetings said, hey, there's going to be some districts that are coming down the pipeline, keep building capacity, keep building this way, so that when district initiatives are starting to come down the pipeline, to obviously from a district standpoint, potentially, then we're ready to go. And we're not spinning our wheels like, unfortunately, what we've done for maybe the last 10 years.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize, as we discussed before, it's a process. So we're not going to be where we want to be overnight, in a year, maybe in 2 years, but we're not going to stop. And we need to kind of, that's the thing that we want everybody to catch on to, is that you may have heard of it before, but we're digging in. We're not stopping, we're going forward. So you may take a while to see the work that's happening, but it's happening.
I'm going to interrupt for just a second and kind of transition.
Good, thank you.
Middle school, high school. But one of the things I want to add here is that, you know, we oftentimes think that if we just do this one thing, we're going to fix this problem and then move on. The great thing about PLCs is that you're developing kind of, PLCs is kind of a process as well as a culture of staff working together. So when you have that kind of culture in place, as things change, because we know that they will, you've got a kind of a support network to recognize that. The vulnerable is like the buzzword right now. I mean, I'm hearing that everywhere, conversations with superintendents and a workshop or class that I just went to, but you've got that culture in place, whatever the next issue is, whether it's COVID or something else, you've got that structure in place to deal with it. So I'm gonna shut up, absolutely, yeah, and let transition to the high school presentation and let Phoebe and Sydney take over. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves real quick?
Sure, so I am Sydney Zune, and I teach physics and chemistry at the high school, and this is Phoebe Valentine, who teaches math. Are you cool that I just asked you? So we're gonna take a closer look at what the PLC process actually is. For you guys, it might answer some of your questions. And so when we have a PLC, again, that's that professional learning community, we meet with our co-teachers that teach the same subjects as us. So we might be meeting with other physics teachers or chemistry teachers or just geometry teachers. But the idea is that we come together and look at some very specific data. And once this process started 10 years ago, these were the 4 questions that were our guiding questions. And these are the general PLC questions kind of across all districts, which you'll notice are a little different than the 5 questions that Steve presented at the beginning of the meeting. So what is it that we want our students to learn? How will we know if they've learned it? What will we do if they don't learn it? And what will we do if they already know it? So this is what guides us. And so with that,
so we kind of have ways of answering each of these questions. What is it that we want our students to learn? How do we answer that? Well, we answer that by meeting as a group and aligning our curriculum, making sure it's aligned to the standards, making sure it's aligned to what our school has decided specifically we want to learn, but also our state standards, national standards, and then setting up our pacing. If I'm teaching Algebra 2 and Sydney's teaching Algebra 2, we should be pretty well aligned as far as when we're learning what things, so that students are getting a more standardized experience, how will we know if they have learned it? This is where we are working together to create and analyze assessments. This kind of was one of the answers that we were getting from what we do is once we've figured out what standards we want students to meet, then we're creating and aligning, or creating assessments and analyzing them. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. What do we do if they don't learn it? Well, that's where we start using the data we've uncovered when analyzing assessments to plan interventions for those students who are not getting it. What do we do if they already know it? That's where we're, again, using that same data, but we're saying, okay, we need to create some enrichment opportunities for those students who are getting it. So those are the things that are happening to answer those questions within the process.
So taking a closer look at that first question, what do we want students to learn? Well, as Phoebe mentioned, we have to align curriculum, and pacing is a big part of that. Part of the PLC intention is that like classes are, again, getting identical experiences as much as possible. If a student has to have a schedule change or something like that, they went from my class to Phoebe's class, it should be a seamless transition. So with that in mind, we really try to make sure our content is identical, within 1 to 2 days. We might have to share lab equipment or something like that, but for the most part, students are getting the same content, the same lessons within a few days of each other. Exams and assessments, as much as possible, really should be the same day, but there are things that happen, but the rule is pretty much within 24 hours, all students are getting the same assessments. And then, again, that whole idea of identical content just across the board. So a big part of the PLC is just kind of we have some kind of dynamic notes that we constantly go back to, and not only do we have our 4 guiding questions, but a big part of this is kind of like our parking lot, or what questions do we have for the next time that we meet. And so it really is that dynamic document that we're coming back to again and again, making sure we all are on the same page, and again, students are getting the same content and getting the content that they are supposed to receive. So with that in mind, the assessment piece is a big part of that as well.
Yeah, a big thing that we do in our PLCs is creating like assessments, and then analyzing the results of those assessments. I started here, this last year was my 12th year, and I know in my first year or two, it was kind of like, okay, well, we're giving a quiz, but my quiz didn't have to be the same as your quiz, and my test didn't have to be the same as your test. And so students are getting different experiences. We're possibly testing different knowledge. They're getting the same grade for a course, but might have had a different experience. So that's why professional learning communities are so valuable, is for multiple reasons. One of them being aligning those assessments, making sure we're giving the same assessments. But another piece of that is using a common education term, backwards by design. What that means is I'm looking at the standards I want students to meet, then I'm creating assessments that will test that, and then I'm going back and figuring out how to get the students to that assessment. So it's starting from the end result that we want, and then figuring out how to get them there. We do that by creating like assessments. We want to make sure they're well aligned with the curriculum. Once we've made these like assessments, now everybody in Algebra 2 is giving the same quizzes and the same tests. Then we can analyze that assessment data. You can see kind of an example, it's really small, but that was just an example of a quiz. I've done tally marks of students that missed it. Sometimes we go a lot more in depth. This is a formative assessment, smaller assessment, so we wouldn't go quite as in depth potentially, but then we take that into our PLC meeting, and this was an algebra quiz. I look at my results, there are 4 of us that teach algebra, we're all looking at our results together. We're saying, oh, your kids did a lot better on question 5. What did you do on question 5? How do you teach that? Oh, you know what, I didn't do as well. And this goes back to what the middle school was talking about earlier, is having that trust, but my kids just didn't do as well on finding the greatest common factor. Can you tell me how you teach that? And I know in the math department, we've often uncovered, like, oh, you teach this method, I've never taught it with that method. You use this activity, okay, I could add in this activity. And so it's really kind of a way for us to figure out the best way to teach different things. But also, we are going to use that data to get onto questions 3 and 4. So like I said, discussing teaching strategies, but also driving our next steps on not only how to maybe tweak an assessment, maybe we go back and look at how well it is aligned, but also then to determine, what do we do with the students who don't know this material? What do we do with the students who do know this material?
So yeah, in order to, we've given the assessment, we've taken in this data, we've analyzed, okay, Phoebe, you did really great doing this, I bombed this, how are we gonna change this? So taking in that data really drives our instruction. Because we have the opportunity to meet weekly, that usually means we can meet just about every time after an assessment, whether it's the formative assessment or the summative assessment. So when we meet after a formative assessment, that's a great opportunity to be like, okay, either I need to do some reteaching, maybe we need to do some interventions and schedule them in Spartan Stretch, and that might just be on me personally as a teacher. It could also be if Phoebe and I, we just couldn't teach stoichiometry, the kids really didn't do a great job. That maybe means, like, you know what, we need to adjust our pacing, and we need to provide time for reteaching. We need to provide a day for reinforcement, or, we need to adjust things. But having that opportunity to have those discussions and be vulnerable, and people be like, you know what, the students really aren't getting this, how can we change this? We might need to look for different research strategies, we might talk to other teachers, but that is the resource that is so valuable of the weekly PLC. In addition, the summative assessment data can be helpful as well. Unfortunately, after the summative assessment, it's not always as helpful for students in terms of, like, we can't always be like, we really need to go back and reteach, but it does provide us as teachers data of, like, okay, the next time we teach this content, so next year or whenever it is, these are some things we need to adjust because students didn't do so well. Hopefully we were able to analyze our formative data appropriately and adjust so that we do well in the summative assessment, and that's helpful data as well. So again, the data and having that opportunity to discuss weekly where our students are doing is just invaluable, and it really helps us drive our instruction and drive student success as well. So with that in mind, we want to return to the first questions that Steve presented with.
Yeah, they look a little bit weird up there, but so these are the questions that are presented at the beginning of every board meeting that focus our profession. There are the focus of our professional learning communities. What do we want students to know and learn? What do students want to know and learn? How will we know if they have learned it? What will we do if they don't learn it? And what do we do if they already know it? So clearly one that we hadn't talked a lot about yet was number 2, and that is certainly something that we feel like as we get further through the PLC process, we can do more of. But another thing to consider is it could feel, every department is at a different place with this, but it could start to feel, once you've created the assessment, you've aligned it, you've compared it, you keep doing better, you can kind of start to feel like you're spinning your wheels, or like, it feels like we're doing the same thing over and over again. But on the flip side of that, most of the high school, our training was 10 years ago when we started this process. That's a long amount of time. We also want to consider the fact that we've got 10 years worth of new teachers that maybe haven't gotten the same level of professional learning community training that we got at the beginning of this. So that's kind of driving we have this need to be re-energized with the PLC process, to be reminded of the PLC process, and to create some new goals. You know, we've done these parts of it. What's the next thing we need to do? We really feel like we need to be reminded of that.
And possibly re-energize a little bit like our middle school friends have promised how they want to success in their coalition. So going back to that first thing that the middle school discussed, is that the PLC is an ongoing process. So this really shouldn't end anytime soon. But teachers need to work collaboratively and have those cycles of inquiry and research to achieve those better results for student instruction. And so in order, what additional needs we need in order to become re-energized, maybe have a little bit more training for some things, is that first of all, we do need that, continued professional development. So the PLC coalition in August, maybe that's something that needs to really be, offered to all. It has been offered to all staff, but maybe a slightly higher push. Maybe incentivized. And then also we just need that clear focus and guidance from our administrators. And how are we going to incorporate that last question that we really haven't addressed in these last 10 years? What do students want to learn? And how can we make sure that we're meeting those needs? So, that was kind of, we wanted to focus a little bit more on like what we at the high school do. The middle school is a little bit more about bigger picture and how they've really revitalized their culture and where they're going. But we just wanted to explain really what happens in a PLC and what we use it for and the invaluable time that it does provide us. But, that was really where the information we wanted to share with you. So, any questions for us, or I don't know if the middle school still?
I would say in general, I'm curious, with the additional or more intentional time on Thursdays, how do you see that improving the PLC process next year? Or has your team talked about how that time would be best utilized?
So for the high school, it's really not different for us because the late start Thursdays we've had since, help me out here.
No. I don't know. I'm not sure.
The high school is the least difference in terms of our schedule and when our PLC has been. So for us, it was weird this year not to have our late start Thursdays. So for the high school, it's not really a big adjustment for us. The late start Thursdays is a common thing. We come in, we have our meetings,
But I think that time's incredibly valuable because that's where we look at this data together. When we haven't always had that time, it's really difficult to, okay, you can meet before school, I can meet after school, you have sports, okay, I have childcare before school, especially with us starting at 7:45, it can be really difficult to find that common time. And if you don't have that time that you're all meeting at the same time, it's really difficult. So, like, I'm not an elementary teacher, but I can't imagine trying to meet across 5 buildings, but I have a child who will be in kindergarten next year. I hope that she's getting the same experience as the other kindergartners, and I've seen how valuable it is for me to be able to meet with the other teachers, to be able to learn from them, to be able to improve instruction for my students. I've seen outcomes for them improve, and so I would love if everybody had that opportunity. So to answer your question about what we do at that time, like that's really where we're creating assessments, comparing assessments, and yes, of course we meet outside of that time, but I know that I will be able to meet with all the algebra teachers on this day at this time. I won't be missing this person for tennis or this person for childcare, whatever it is. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Although I'd welcome any middle school PLC members to answer as well.
We've talked about it briefly, but until it's like set in stone and we're actually gonna get that time, we've kind of talked about some things we could potentially do with it, but nothing set in stone. Just mostly brainstorming ideas at this point.
I will say, just having that consistency is key, especially as most of us teach more than one subject. So, you know, I, for example, meet with my physics PLC twice a month and my chemistry twice a month. So like, but just knowing that I'm at least meeting with those additional, or those other teachers at least twice a month to make sure we are aligned, to make sure we're on the same pages, is just really important and helpful.
And you know that that time is reserved. There's not gonna be an IEP that I have during that time, and the other teacher has a 504, or whatever it is. It's a time you know you are all going to be available. It's precious time to be able to ensure everyone's there.
Sure.
Right, to go back to where, with the middle school where they started, it's a culture in terms of like, that time is specifically for these 5 questions, how are we going to answer them, and how are we gonna serve our students? So, that focus is really where it needs to be and where it stays.
And I guess going back to the scientific methods discussion that we had earlier, I mean, that's the question that every the board as a whole, has to answer for ourselves, is that trade-off of educational time versus PLC time, which one ends up being more effective for the student at the end of the day? And we won't know, I guess, until we try in some ways.
And I think that, I believe it was Justin that was saying this earlier, was like, we had to make adjustments to our curriculum and focus on the most important thing. And we found that, and not that we want less time, we want more time, but with less time, we were able to still meet that level. And I think that I save more classroom time by having the PLC process that makes my time in the classroom more structured and focused, and then we can figure out exactly what we're doing versus potentially having some time that's not being utilized as well.
Oh, I can believe that 100%. So I'd say I'm generally in favor of the dedicated time, and if you went back to my high school days, I'm sure I could have found 9 days worth of time in the whole year that were wasted in something that wasn't productive. So I guess if anything, this perhaps is the best time to be doing this, because we have just spent a year's worth of exercise in identifying the critical things that we need to have. Now hopefully we've got the time to implement PLC, and then we can start adding back in where we find extra capacity. So.
Absolutely, I think that would be a huge part of next year would be, and a big potential focus for that is how do, and I feel like that's a big question for next year, is how do we combine what we did 2 years ago with what we did last year in the technology side of things, in the curriculum side of things. We used different assessments. I think it's going to be super important for the high school, who already had it, but I cannot imagine not having that time where we could say, okay, which assessment are we using? How do we need to change it? Is it meeting the standards? What are we going to do with this technology, and making sure our teachers are on the same page with each other and students are.
How do we change what we're doing with the 140 new bills being signed?
Right, well, and it ensures data-driven instruction. There's not a study out there that tells you not to do data-driven instruction, so in order to make sure that that is occurring, and then again, to have the identical experiences, and which is best practice, I can't imagine how you can
Right, it's like, we can't do the scientific method without the PLC process. It's like, it's our time that we're using it. It's our time that we're using data to drive instruction, exactly.
Reacting to the science of it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, ladies.
Jeff,
Thank you.
I'm gonna get the screen kind of reoriented, but that really, That wraps up that agenda item under superintendent's report. The last one is in the intergovernmental agreement with the Sycamore Park District. We've had a long-standing intergovernmental agreement with the Park District. It's been in place for several years, it's been in place for quite a few years. I'm new to the school district. We have a new executive director of the Park District. We both agreed to taking a look at that. Intergovernmental agreement made a lot of sense. Janelle Bailey is the executive director of the Park District. She took the lead on that. It bounced back and forth a couple of times, but after bouncing back and forth, I'd like to present that, just a slightly revised intergovernmental agreement, updated agreement with the Park District for board approval tonight.
Is there a motion to approve the intergovernmental agreement with the Park District as presented?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded, discussion?
Steve, maybe could you provide just a couple of high-level points of any fundamental changes, or I didn't see a before and after version per se, so I didn't go line.
So about as high level as it gets is updating some of the names in the agreement, you know, who's in charge. I mean, it really, yeah, dates, and because some of those people have changed, some of the dates have changed, really the substance of the agreement is the same. It was really just kind of clarifying who's in those roles now. So for example, coordinating schedules when they use some of our facilities is going to be either Mark Ekstrom or Chauncey Carrick. It really was just updating some of that stuff, really pretty minor.
I think the basic agreement is that we agree to share facilities when we can, we agree to share equipment when we can, and the taxpayer comes out as the winner.
And one thing that both entities agreed on was that their programs and their facilities come first. So our,
Right.
you know, our facilities will be used by Sycamore students first based on our needs, but when they're available, we're going to make them available to the Park District and vice versa. So really good agreement there. Really, I've got a pretty good working relationship with Janelle already. So looking forward to finalizing this and then continuing to move forward.
Yeah, I think we've had a very good working relationship with the Park District for quite some time now. So. Wasn't always that way, but for quite a while now it's been that way, so that's good. Any other discussion? Roll call.
Shiloh?
Yes.
Davey?
Yes.
DeVito?
Yes.
Jones?
Yes.
Quinn?
Yes.
Johnson?
Yes.
Motion carried.
Open discussion, issues, observations. Questions?
The joint conference? Joint conference is coming up in November. I've got 3 people that I know that are going, and I didn't know if anybody else wants to go. I need registration to open up June 8th, so we want to get that registered.
Yeah,
If you
sooner
plan
the
on
better.
going,
Yeah.
let me know soon.
Like preferably by the end
By
of
the
this
end of the
week.
yeah. Great.
Future agenda items?
I would just reiterate any changes to
Yeah.
curriculum that we should be aware of at the end of the presentation, especially anything where the board would be asked to provide direction if it is something that the district has a choice in.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see if we have a choice in any of those approaches.
The way some of those bills are written, there is some choice, but until, you know, Pritzker has signed them, and then we get a little bit more guidance on what exactly is going to be required. So I made a note to come back. We'll do that in July if we can. Otherwise, we'll do it in August or whenever we get to it first. But
In particular, the new sex education bill actually did make some changes and does give some flexibilities. That would be good to know about. Other future agenda items? Is there a motion to go into executive session for the consideration of matters related to the appointment, employment, discipline, or dismissal of personnel, purchase or lease of real property for the use of the district, negotiations, and imminent litigation?
I'll motion.
Second.
Who gets the?
I heard her. She's closest. Sorry.
Seated
Roll call.
This old lady's hearing it does. Davy?
Yes.
DeVito?
Yes.
Jones?
Yes.
Ren?
Yes.
Shiloh?
Yes.
Dominic? Motion carried.
Okay, we're back in regular session, and is there a motion to approve the personnel report as presented?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded, roll call?
Jones?
Yes.
Ren?
Yes.
Shiloh?
Yes.
Davy?
Yes.
DeVito?
Yes.
Dominic?
Yes.
Motion carried.
Is there a motion to approve the amendment to the superintendent's employment agreement as presented?
So moved.
Second.
Roll call?
Ren?
Yes.
Shiloh?
Yes.
Davy?
Yes.
DeVito?
Yes.
Jones?
Yes.
Dominic?
Yes.
Motion carried.
Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Everybody in favor?
Yes.
Aye.
All right, we are adjourned.
Don't forget, what's July 13th? Whose
Board meeting.
birthday?